it's a formula based purchases.
What they can afford to pay based on 40% of they don't want to exceed 30% of their
Winter isn't coming, it came.
Okay, we've got a green light. We can get to work. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Thursday, April 11, 2019 meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority. Roll call, please, Ms. Ellison.
Commissioner Fisher?
Here.
Commissioner Staunton?
Here.
Commissioner Brindle? Here. Commissioner Anderson?
Here.
Chair Hovland?
Here. We have a form of meeting agenda in front of us this morning. Manager Neal, would wish to modify the agenda at all? Or Executive Director Neal, I should say.
Yes, Your Honor, we could do it now, or we can get to it under reports and recommendations, but we are recommending that you table item A under reports and recommendations to the next meeting of the HRA.
Mr. Mayor, I move approval of the agenda without 6A.
Second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second to approve the agenda with the exception of 6A, which will be removed from the agenda. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Carried. Community comment. Is there anyone in the audience wishes to address the HRA in a matter of concern to them that's not otherwise on the agenda this morning? Mr. Anhut, welcome. Just happened to notice you there. Maybe you want to make a broader community comment? I mean, you actually got here this morning. That's that deserves some recognition, I think. All right, and Mr. Bonjean as well made it out over. Adoption of the consent agenda. We have several items on the consent agenda. Is there anyone on the HRA that wishes to remove an item from the consent agenda? If not, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the consent agenda as shown.
So
Second.
Got a motion and second to adopt the consent agenda as shown. Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carried. And then on to reports and recommendations. 6A is tabled to our next meeting, and then we are on to B, and Mr. Neuendorf has this matter. This is dealing with the redevelopment agreement with France Avenue Equities that our staff and our advisors, our very able advisors, have been working on here for some time. Mr. Neuendorf.
Yes, good morning. Thank you. This item is not a new item. It's actually the conclusion of a project we've been working on for several months and several years through the zoning process. But this morning we have a full redevelopment agreement on the agenda for your consideration. This agreement has been prepared based on the terms and conditions that were previously approved by both the HRA board and the city council. The document's been prepared by the HRA's legal team in close conjunction with the property owner developer and the developer's representative. I'll run through a brief presentation. There's a more complete presentation that was in your packet. I'm going to go through the highlights since we've looked at this on several occasions. The site is the 7200 and 7250 France Avenue properties. These are two aging office buildings in not the best of conditions. This is an image of the project that secured final rezoning approvals just a few weeks ago. It's the same project that worked its way through the Planning Commission and City Council late last fall. And for those not familiar with the site, there's a long history on this property. This is the fourth or fifth project that was proposed. The previous three or four were not able to move forward, but this one did secure final rezoning. This morning, though, we're not talking about the design of the project, but we're talking about public participation in order to make it feasible and to make it happen. We're recommending that tax increment financing be used in this case. And the slide here is a familiar one. It shows the three-step process mandated by Minnesota law. The first step we took a few weeks ago when the City Council established the TIF district. That happened in March. The second step is the one where you actually start putting the project deliverables together, the specific deliverables, and in this case, that step 2 is following through on a recommendation to provide TIF funding through a TIF note to the project, and so that's the action that we're asking your consideration of today. Late last fall, as the developer was working through the Planning Commission and the City Council on the zoning, they also made a request for $12 million in tax increment financing to help support the project and to make it viable. For several months, staff did a thorough analysis. We engaged our advisors at Dorsey and Whitney, working with Jay Lindgren and Alex Selke, and also our financial advisors at Ehlers and Associates. Nick Anhut has been our main advisor there. After thorough analysis of their performas, of their budget, of their returns, of their numbers, we did confirm a substantial financial gap in their budget. Staff does recommend we follow through to satisfy their request of a $12 million TIF note. That's just part of what's going to make this project successful, though. The gap is significant, so the developer will also need to contribute additional equity, both in the form of cash and land, in order to secure the private financing, and are also pursuing outside grants. So just this week, we had good news from the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. They did award the project a $500,000 grant. We're pursuing at least one other grant, but it's this combination of 3 sources that will be necessary to make the project viable: additional equity from the owner, tax increment financing, and grants. The contract that's in the packet today follows through on the terms that were approved back in February. So the rest of these slides that I'll go through, I'm going to run through them quickly. We're happy to answer questions, of course, but these are the slides that outline the general terms and conditions back in February. So those have not changed. They have been clarified in a couple of instances. We took, I believe, a 6-page term sheet with bullet points and transformed it into a 200-page legal contract. So there's a lot more detail, a lot more meat to it, but the general nature of the project has not changed. So the minimum improvements on the site are the 2 apartment buildings with commercial space on the first floor. The primary reason that we feel TIF is justified in this case is due to the 20% affordable housing units that are included in the project. They'll be included not just to satisfy the 15 years required by the zoning approval, but they are willing to extend them an additional 10 years, so we'll have a total term of 25 years for those affordable units. There's also a great deal of public space on the site, much more than would normally be provided, and that is also something that adds to the cost to the developer but doesn't add to the return, and something that can be enjoyed by the community. The overall budget is the same, about $111 million to have this project constructed. That is that's the cost that we've been measuring towards. So on the right side of the screen, you see a summary of the sources in order to pay for the project. The owners estimated to be putting in over $30 million in equity in both cash and land. They'll seek private financing of about $69 million. The TIF note at a pledge of $12 million. And then grants to be determined. As of yesterday, we could put in $500,000 and hopefully more there. So as we've run through this project in the past, I wanted to hopefully do a better job of clearly indicating where the $12 million comes from and where it goes towards. So the project budget includes a lot of TIF qualified costs. The Minnesota state law is fairly broad in what it would consider an eligible cost under TIF. The city of Edina's policy is much more narrow. So according to the state law, there's about $22 million in developer costs that theoretically could be eligible. Staff does not support $22 million. What staff does support is shown in the summary on the right side of the screen that comes up to a total not to exceed $12 million. So that would pay for part of the demolition, the site preparation. The grant would also pay for some of that, but every grant requires a match. The grant doesn't pay for everything, so it's you know, a little bit from the state, a little bit from the city, and a lot from the developer to get the demolition and site prep moving. The streetscape and public realm improvements are considered eligible in our opinion. If any additional grants come in to help pay for some of that, we would deduct that from the cost that's eligible. Stormwater improvements, we've talked about stormwater here for many, many years, and the fact that this property has been designed for better or for worse to not just handle their water, but all the neighbors' waters as well. So we hope to do that in a little bit more cohesive way and something that lasts for the long term. The primary cost that we're looking at as far as TIF eligibility here is the affordable housing. 62 units of housing that would be leased and priced to families and households earning 60% of the area median income. So the staff recommendation stands, just like it did back in February, that we issue a TIF note or a TIF pledge upon completion not to exceed the $12 million. I included this slide. It's actually taken from the March presentation on the creation of the TIF district. But there is some confusion about the figures in the TIF district budget versus the developer's budget. So I thought I'd put them back out here and hopefully explain them a little bit more clearly. So while staff recommends a TIF note of $12 million to the developer, the TIF plan also has to have a budget. In the TIF plan, we tend to round up a little bit to be a little bit more flexible. When we negotiate with developers, we tend to round down because we want to get the best project for the city at the best price. So the budget in the TIF plan is a little bit higher, and that's a total of $28.4 million. That's the cumulative amount of incremental property taxes that Ehlers has estimated would be generated from the property. The TIF plan does show a number of different expense items that we could identify as TIF reimbursable. Theoretically, site acquisition, site improvements, the site prep, demolition, those types of things, some utility work. Affordable housing is the largest category that would be eligible. A number of miscellaneous site improvements. There's an administrative line item and then also an interest line item. Now, the numbers in this TIF plan budget are movable. So as long as we don't exceed the 28.4, we comply with the TIF plan. So I know there was some confusion at our last meeting, but we purposely have the numbers in the TIF plan a little bit higher than what we offer the developer, just to make sure there's some wiggle room if the city needs that in the future. So the recommendation of support for the development at $12 million in a note, plus it's an interest-bearing note, it certainly falls within the maximum limit identified in the TIF plan. So far, yes, sir.
Good to have just a little bit more explanation on budget versus actual. I mean, what our commitment is 12 million. You've made that clear, but we have a budget that's more than double that. So,
sure.
I think for folks at home that might be watching this and later on, or even in the audience, and for the council or the HRE too, I think it'd be good to have a clear distinction on what we're talking about here in terms of budget versus actual. Mr. Anhut.
Thank you. Mayor, council members, Nick Anhut from Ehlers & Associates. And as Mr. Neuendorf mentioned, as part of the TIF process, you do need to set a budget for the life of the TIF district. The only caveat I would add to what he has stated is we're actually encompassing all of the properties. So this projection of increment includes not only the affordable housing units and the commercial that's integrated within that mixed use, but also an assumption that the townhomes are also being developed, and the increment from those townhomes are not pledged to the developer under the terms of the proposed agreement in front of you. So the numbers are going to be larger because we're talking about a larger piece of property. In addition, you're only pledging about 90% of the increment to pay that $12 million note. So we're retaining 10% for future HRA use in administering the district or other affordable housing needs. So the budget is going to be larger. It's the framework within which you can operate and spend the TIF money. Part of that framework is to assist this project, about $12 million in upfront development costs that'll be repaid over the course of 20 years. That $12 million is likely going to bear some interest cost, roughly about $7 to $8 million of interest cost over that life, but then you will also have additional projects that you can support from within this budget.
That prompt any questions from nature? Commissioner Brindle.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to a couple of words that you used, other affordable housing needs. So looking at that administrative fee of 10%, represented here as $2.7 million. So how is that $2.7 million applied to a future other affordable housing needs, taking what you just said? So I'm picking out what people are going to hear and wanting some clarification on what you mean by that.
So as Mr. Neuendorf mentioned, these are items that can be moved around in the future, but we need to set a cap on the total amount today within the budget. You are allowed under the statute to obtain or retain 10% of the expenditures of the district for administrative purposes, to administer the TIF district, to negotiate future deals or negotiate the deal at hand. And we've set aside that 10% within that $2.7 million. It doesn't obligate you to actually spend these dollars on administrative items. You could choose in the future to modify your budget and allocate a portion of that towards other needs that are the other line items that are listed on the budget.
So it's for administrative fees related to affordable housing, whether it's this project or another?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you. Just a question about the interest. Basically, just to state it simply, we have a $12 million TIF note that's issued to the developer, and over the course of 20 years, we're paying interest on the TIF note that we're granting.
That is correct.
Yeah. Also, and they, well, the interest will come about as a result of them pledging the TIF note as collateral, I presume, for lending purposes.
They can pledge it as collateral for lending purposes, or it could be to reimburse them for their additional equity that they're providing up front.
Okay.
It's their choice.
Well, Section 8.3 is what I'm looking at in the Redevelopment Agreement. And I know you don't have it in front of you, so not
they
to
could
nail
do
it.
either.
They have the right to do that. That's
Correct.
all I'm trying to establish.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Any other commissioners? Commissioner Staunton?
And then if the value increased by more than we're anticipating, it would be possible for enough increment to be accumulated that we could pay off the note early. Correct?
Correct. We are anticipating some appreciation, about 1% within our projections. But as I mentioned, again, you're only pledging 90% of the mixed-use project increment to the TIF note. It's wholly within your discretion whether or not you want to pledge or not pledge, but on an annual basis, maybe after things have shaken out, you've decided what other affordable housing needs you have. You want to leverage those additional resources to pay down that note faster. You certainly have that opportunity. But the numbers that I quoted and were stating assumes that you'd spread it out over the full term of the district and pay it off as pledged.
But the point is they're all projected values that
Correct.
that if it comes up short, then we just don't pay anymore on the note, and the developer is on the risk. But if it comes up long, then we have some options. We could close the district down early by paying the note off early, or we could use those excess funds for something that's consistent with the TIF district.
That is correct.
All right, thank you.
That prompt any other questions by commissioners? All right, good. All right, thanks, Mr. Annett. Mr. Neuendorf, go ahead.
All right, so I'll continue. So I wanted to just summarize where we are today, what's been finished, and what's still remaining to be considered. So we approved the term sheet, both the HRA and the City Council, back in February. We moved forward and established that housing TIF district with the budget that Mr. Annett just explained last month in March. The developer just obtained final site plan approvals from the City Council about a week or two ago. We've got the one grant secured, that's the good news of the week, and we're pursuing one other one from Met Council. So that's things that are in progress or completed.
Bill, can I interrupt you
Yes,
for
sir.
just 1 second? It's probably, I think it's worth saying that, of the grants that were given, this one was by far the biggest one, which I think is a point worth celebrating, that, when compared to all the other competing projects out there, this one not only got money, but was by far deemed the most worthy. And I just think that's worth just pausing for 1 second and just hearing that. Okay.
And to segue off that, I was also sitting here thinking, I think Mr. Neuendorf in his grant writing and assistance to these applicants is about 3 for 3 or 4 for 4.
We've had a good couple of years.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
Yeah, so,
exactly. One more to go.
putting you in the exemplary category too. Good work.
Thanks.
And incidentally, I would just comment quickly that who said state government's impersonal? I had a voicemail from the Commissioner of Deed a couple of days ago saying, "Hey, Mayor, want to get together with you, want to meet you. I live in Southwest Minneapolis, and by the way, we approved a grant for the 7250 project for $500,000. So congratulations." So that was nice to get that personalized sort of service from state government.
These grant programs are pretty effective, and I would expect a press release later this week with full details. But as Member Fisher mentioned, I believe 4 different projects, 4 different cities received awards in this particular program in this year. And this Edina project received a grant of $500,000. The other projects received grants in the $100,000 to $200,000 range. So this one, it was a big ask. I mean, there's some big expenses to get this project going, but Deed stepped up and recognized the value to not just to the community, but also to the region and the state. So look for a press release from them in the next couple of days on that one. So as I mentioned, a lot of these terms that I'll walk through real quickly here are the same as back in February. They're the same as back in March. They haven't really changed. So we're talking about issuing a TIF note after the developer substantially finishes the project. So the developer is at risk to go out and get the rest of the funding together, to get the project going, to get the construction started, and then to get the construction finished. When he finishes all the public space, when he finishes the apartment buildings and the commercial space, and when he starts building that first townhome to really buffer the neighbors, that's when we will make sure that he's got all the paperwork in place. That's when the city issues the note, and that's when interest would start being earned on the balance of that note. So that's a few years in the future before we actually even start that process. One of the standard things that the city does is always include a look back, and we do it on 2 occasions to make sure that the note is sized properly and still appropriate. So we've always said that is a $12 million maximum note. If somehow the developer finds a way to cut $10 million out of their budget, cost savings, material savings, or whatever, we'll resize that note appropriately. Also, if the project is sold at some point in the future and monetized and recognizes the grand slam home run profit from the developer, we go back and look at the TIF note and make sure that his returns isn't overly enriched by using TIF. And if necessary, we would actually take back some of those funds. So there's a couple safety valves in there that we do just as a matter of standard practice.
Would you hold on that slide for a moment, please? I had a question for you, Mr. Neuendorf. On the $500,000 penalty provision, I don't think that'll occur, but wisely it's in there. How do we collect that if there is a penalty? Is it a reduction in the TIF assistance, or how do we do that?
Yep. So if the developer fails to finish the townhomes on time, he starts them and only finishes 6 or 8 or whatever, but he doesn't get to the full 10. That's required. Then we would reduce his TIF note by $500,000. At that point in time, if he reaches that penalty period, he'll still owe money or there'll still be money on the TIF note, and so we would just reduce it by $500,000.
There'll be sufficient amount left on the TIF note to be able to pay the penalty.
Correct.
All right, thank
Correct.
you. Commissioner Anderson.
Thank you. Just a question on clawback. So the process is complicated on clawback, if I read this correctly. We have, essentially, there's a 15-year timeline. Correct me if any place that I'm wrong. We have a 15-year timeline here to determine the internal rate of return as computed by the developer and then audited by, I suppose, a third party that we name. Incremental sales along the way don't really come into consideration for recapture. But the total at the end of 15 years are if the whole project were to be sold. Is that accurate?
That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. So if the whole project were to be sold at some point lower than 15 years, less than 15 years, for instance, the townhouse pads are there. It appears that someone else will be building them, if I understand everything that's been presented here. So those will be sold. The commercial space could be sold. The project itself, the whole building, could be sold sooner than 15 years, or it could be sold incrementally. But we don't worry about that until either it's been completely sold or 15 years.
That's exactly correct.
Okay. All right.
And for just the reason that you described, the developer at some point in the future might decide to sell the commercial space. They
Yes.
might decide to sell one building or half of one and not the other. It's hard to predict the future, so that's why in the clawback we just say when there's a full sale or when we get to 15 years, we'll value it to make sure we have not overly enriched the project.
Have we ever on any other project where that has been involved, where the clawback provision has been involved, have we ever collected anything, or has that ever come into play in the past?
Boy, yeah, in our experience in Edina, I don't believe it has.
Okay.
In my career, I've only had to do it once in one project.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Nundorf.
So again, this is an affordable housing TIF district, so there's a lot of conversation in the document about the affordable housing units. It's 20% of the units, that's all the same. We did include a provision based on some of the requests to have affordability for a longer term. We included a provision that gives the HRA the option, the first option, to potentially buy those units if it would be sold in the future or converted to condominium. It doesn't obligate the city or the HRA to purchase those units, but it puts our foot in the door. This provision might come in 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So it's something that we don't know if we'll actually exercise it, but there's been a lot of conversation about extending that term of affordability, and this is one way for us to potentially do it. So we did include that term. We also included a provision that both parties would sit down in good faith just prior to the termination of that 25-year period and see if there's a way to extend it, not by the city taking ownership, but by the developer retaining ownership. Again, hard to come up with what is the path to success in 25 years, but we did want to make sure that there's a sincere opportunity to sit down and have a conversation about what it takes and how that might happen. We also had mentioned about a lot of the public realm space on the property. This is the same slide as last time, but about 45% of the land area will actually have a public access easement over it. The streetscapes on France, Gallagher, and 72nd, the conservation area in the back to buffer the neighbors, that whole Woonerf internal road, about 45% of the land will be permanently dedicated to public use and a public access. We also included a provision, since there is public space in the property, that the developer would grant a permanent public easement to about half of the parking on the property. The lower level, the P2 level, would be dedicated to the residential use. That's a private area. But most of that P1 level, that would be more appropriate for customers or visitors to the property, again, will have a permanent public easement at no cost to the city. And then finally, we'll also have an easement or a declaration of use on the stormwater facility to more formally have the neighbors continue to enjoy the use of that property for their stormwater needs.
I think those tanks will look real good behind the townhouses.
They'll be real good. They'll look real nice with about 10 feet of dirt piled on top of them. And one of the other final pieces, I know there was some conversation about this at the recent city council meeting, but the developer will also redo at his expense a portion of West 72nd Street. The developer will pay for that first block from France Avenue to Lindmar to completely reconstruct that roadway in a manner that calms traffic and discourages cut-through traffic and high-speed traffic. It's my understanding that the engineering department will take a look at the utilities under the road, and since they're redoing the road, if it makes sense, if it's time to redo the water pipe or the sewer pipe, the regular city funds would take care of those utilities. And then our engineering department is also doing a study further down 72nd all the way to Cornelia. My understanding is that they'll do some test efforts this year and kind of see what the neighbors like, what they don't like, what works better, what doesn't work very well. And then if there is something that the neighbors are agreeable to and is effective, it's their intention to fund those in the near future, going down to Cornelia. We initially had been, frankly, pushing on the developer to fund more of those programs. But when you create a TIF district, you have to do the work within the district. And that first block of 72nd is clearly in the district. But if we would extend the district to go 4 blocks further west, that starts to get into residential neighborhoods. It starts to get far too complicated. And on the advice of our council, we decided to just let the developer do what clearly falls into the state law, and we would have the city step up and do some of the other repairs further into the neighborhood. So in conclusion, as I mentioned, the team at Dorsey and Whitney has prepared the full redevelopment agreement. I believe it's 187 pages at my last count. That follows the terms and conditions that were previously approved. The developer and property owner and his representative, Blake Bonjean and Michael Margulies, are in the audience, and they have signed the agreement. They are agreeable to its terms. At this point, we fully recommend that we move forward with this project and move forward with the redevelopment agreement. Our team is fully assembled, ready for any questions, and we're happy to take any.
Good, thank you. Questions by commissioners? This has been very carefully worked on over the many months, I guess, that we've had this project in front of us. Any thoughts or questions that have come to mind? All right. Commissioner Fisher.
I was just going to say that, you know, it's a full 187 pages, and I've looked at a lot of development agreements over my career, and I'm always amazed at how much detail goes into these. It's almost like there's not one thing. We think about, well, gee, they didn't anticipate this, or they didn't anticipate that. There's a lot of anticipation in these development agreements, and I literally went through the thing, and I couldn't find anything that I would have question on or a concern? Because I think we've talked about, some of the bigger issues, and feels like it's all good in my mind. So thank you.
Thank you. Shown on my agenda, Ms. Hawkinson, you're also on here with Mr. Neuendorf. I don't know if you have any supplemental comments that you want to make. All right. No. All right. Okay. Good. Thank you. Yeah, I would join Member Fisher, Commissioner Fisher. It's just a really wonderful piece of legal work and negotiating. I thank everybody involved, all the parties that were involved in this, to create, I think, one of the most iconic sort of projects we're going to see in Edina for years. So to be able to have the ability to be able to take an entire block, Mr. Bonjean, thanks for being able to negotiate that, and redevelop a tired block. No offense to your property, but it was time for regeneration of this, just like we've seen some of our single-family homes torn down and rebuilt into something that's even more beautiful.
Well, thanks to the council for the perseverance.
We're going to get there, I think. And all right, so any other comments? Otherwise, we've got a motion.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Commissioner.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of things. I don't want to revisit too much of what I've spoken about in the past. I do want to just say that to me, the most attractive pieces of this project, and there are many attractive pieces to it, are the stormwater mitigation and the affordable housing component. I think they're both really, really critical for our town. I again would say I hesitate to say that it's a great idea to commit $5 million for extension of affordability beyond the time when we should really be making that decision. Because we have an affordable housing issue to deal with, and I think we're smarter and better and more committed to affordable housing than to make a decision to spend these dollars with the tax capacity in the district before we need to. Now, I do understand that the computation is really about the gap, and that the 10 years of additional affordability there is computed into the gap. Okay, but we're still committing $5 million in 15 years to extend it. Not only that, but we're paying interest on it. The interest that we're paying on those $5 million that's just troubling to me, that we should be doing that. I just think that there are better ways to spend these dollars for more permanent solutions. So, having said that, the other thing about equity here and the ability to ask for consideration in 15 years or sooner is that there is an incredible amount of equity in the commercial aspect of this alone. DJR just sold a project on 70th and France for $8.2 million, which was 6,700 feet. That's about $1,330 a foot, which is that's a significant capture. And look, a developer has every right in the world to do their business and be profitable. When I compute that out to the commercial square feet that are involved here, I take a look at it and I come up with 34.5 million. If at 28,026 square feet times 1231, I come out with $34.5 million, which could be gained upon sale, which could be gained upon completion and leasing of that commercial space and its sale. And it seems to me that with those kinds of numbers at $34.5 million, there are ways to offset the interest commitment that we are making on an award, the TIF note that's being awarded the developers. So that's my concern. I like the project. I like a lot of pieces of it. It's worthy of TIF consideration. We need affordable housing. That's the biggest piece of this. So thank you for that.
Mr. Anhut, any comment on that?
I don't have any comment. If there's a question, I'd be happy to address it.
Right.
I think it's all valid points to consider, but again, the need is today. The gap is occurring today with the construction of the project, and so that's the pledge that they're seeking, is that you have that commitment today.
Thank you. Yeah, those are very good points I think the commissioners raised, and some of them we've discussed before, and I think Manager Hawkinson has addressed that as well in the past, and we've had this ongoing commitment to affordable housing and thinking about doing it in different ways, and this is one of the ways we've committed ourselves to working on this. And I think Mr. Nuendorf stated right off the bat that this is a housing TIF district, and the $12 million in TIF is primarily to assist on that affordable housing piece, and we've had that discussion in the past. So I'm going to support it, but we're going to do this on a voice vote. So I'll entertain a motion to approve the redevelopment agreement and authorize staff to implement the terms of the agreement.
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion second to approve the redevelopment agreement and to authorize staff to implement the terms of the agreement. Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Aye. Carried. Thank you, everybody, for your comments.
I have a follow-up question.
Member Commissioner Brindle.
Thank you. So this redevelopment agreement stands alongside redevelopment agreements that we have in place for other projects, and some of them, a couple of them have tax increment financing related to them. Those with affordable housing committed to them have a term of affordable housing, and it's a specific term, such as this one is 25 years. We've got 15 years on another project. The ARIA and the future project, the Millennium Project on the kitty corner of 66th and Xerxes. So we have these development agreements that stand alongside each other, and each has a term. So the expiration of these terms is beyond my sitting here. It might be beyond the careers of some sitting in this room. So who keeps track of when a term is coming due, or the time by which the townhomes need to be completed? Who keeps track of these calendars so that we're sure that the terms that we've set in place as to time periods are being monitored, and everybody's kept to their word?
That's a great question, Member Brindle. I've got a two-part answer for you. There is the soft way that we keep track of that. On the dais this morning was a copy of Exhibit M. It's the City of Edina's Housing Policy Program Guide. And that really gets into the how of how these units are monitored and tracked, and make sure that the right type of families are living in the right type of units. That's a program that Stephanie Hawkinson, our Affordable Housing Development Manager, oversees. We have engaged an outside group called Affordable Housing Connections to help us with that monitoring, because that's what they do. So that's the short-term look to make sure that the units are actually leased and rented to the right folks in the right income range. On the longer-term perspective, it's a great question, because if it was up to me, I would probably forget what year this one expired versus that one, and that's when we rely on our legal experts. So Roger Knutson writes the restrictive covenants on projects that do not have TIF involved. So when a site is rezoned, like the ARIA or the Millennium, the Aurora on France, the Market Street project, the 45th and France project, there's a restrictive covenant that goes along with the zoning that gets filed and recorded with the title of the property, so that it's always known and evident that those units are affordable for whatever that term of that contract says. When we negotiate TIF, we have the ability to get a little bit longer term, but we have a very similar restrictive covenant that's prepared as part of the agreements. I forgot which exhibit it is in this packet. But there's a restrictive covenant recorded with the property title that always declares, how long that is valid and binding. And that's the best way to monitor it, because you can just do a title search and find it. So whether I'm here in 25 years or not, or whether Stephanie is here in 25 years, there's always paperwork recorded with that title.
All right. Director Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Brindle. The other informal way that we would keep track of these kind of things is that behind the scenes, for the past 2 years, we've been really ramping up sort of the staffing components of the HRA. So we have a regular HRA staff meeting every 2 weeks. It involves the folks you see in this room, plus a few more, where we have a regular agenda. We go over projects that are in the pipeline, projects that have just been recently passed, sort of a collective intelligence sort of process. And that's another way we keep track of past commitments, current commitments, and future commitments.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Mr.
Yes.
Chair, may I add one thing?
Mr.
Again,
Lindgren.
for the record, Jay Lindgren with the Dorsey and Whitney firm special counsel to the HRA. The other thing is the entire agreement through a memorandum is recorded against the property. So beyond whatever tracking is there, this is a legal document that remains against the property. So if you didn't think about it for 15 years, you could go back and find it all, and it's all there.
But I think Commissioner Brindle's point was maybe we should have, if you don't have it, some kind of tickler system when things come up, they're supposed to come up in sequence that is put into the calendar. Don.
So, Chair and members of the Commission, I'd also like to say from an accounting perspective, so when we talk about a tickler system, so we set up a separate fund for every tax increment district where revenues and expenditures are coded against. And every year we're required by statute to submit a report to the State Auditor's Office. So that will continue. So on an annual basis, we will review this.
We've learned some valuable lessons through the Centennial Lakes maintenance fee discussion. Yep.
Good, thank you. Other commissioners may have some final comments on this as well, but I was just thinking about Commissioner Anderson's comments, and they, to me, they really speak to the notion of how expensive affordable housing is to do as you go about the task of trying to create housing that's affordable for people in your community. And there's many different ways to approach it. I continue to be perplexed and bothered by the fact that the market doesn't seem to be fixing the problem of that delta between real wages and escalating housing costs. And so it seems to me that so far it's fallen primarily on the shoulders of government to try to figure out, and nonprofits to try to figure out how to solve this delta problem. And I think it's really, in a broader way, something that we really need to address as not only a community, but because we're blessed here with being able to kind of figure it out. But as a state, as a country, how are we going to figure out how to solve this delta problem when the market itself is not solving the problem and people aren't able to live in a way they should be able to live in an affordable way all across the country in large cities and small towns. So really quite a vexing issue. Thank you for those comments this morning. Commissioner Staunton.
So the only other thing I would add is I think Commissioner Anderson and the chair's comments are another reminder of the need to take a step back and do a comprehensive housing strategy plan, and that is something we have in the works. Having said that, we need to deal with things as they come up as well, and our affordable housing policy, which was first adopted in the fall of 2015 and has been revised and amended since then, is an effort to make sure we're not missing opportunities as they arise while we're trying to figure out the longer term strategy. So I think this is a good step, but we need eventually to put this into context, and I know that's going to come before us as a city council here shortly, to think more about the future of our community from a housing perspective, not just about affordable housing, but the whole spectrum of housing types, varieties, and affordability.
Good, thank you. Commissioner Fisher.
Not to pile on too much, I do really appreciate Commissioner Anderson's comments. I think they're really thoughtful and an important way to look at this. And, you know, as I consider let's just call it, there's some inefficiency in this vehicle compared to if you took that same amount of money and we've already found some other creative ways to fund some affordable housing that seem to be highly efficient use of money. But the vehicle that we have here has these other complicating parts, which is how do you get this project to happen to start with, or we have no money, we have no housing here. And so I've sort of reconciled in my own brain that we're going to have hopefully more efficient, higher efficient uses of creating affordable housing out there. But even in these conditions, the overall good is far better than, you know, it's like sometimes I try to hit the home run and I'm trying to learn that hitting a good double or even a couple singles really works as well. And so on the whole, I think this is, you know, I feel this is a good thing to do and a good use of the money. But I really appreciate your analysis in that way.
Thank you.
Commissioner.
You know, I started a brief conversation with Member Anderson this morning, and that is, you know, looking at how we all get here. We run for election, and we convince people that we are, we're upstanding, we're honest, and I'm not being facetious at all, and that we truly want to do our best job here. And I want to commend Ron for what he brings to this council. You know, when Member Stewart was here, when Commissioner Stewart was here, he brought a financial analytical approach to things that, frankly, I need. I don't look far enough under the hood to see how the numbers work and what that future in those numbers really looks like. So, and I appreciated Member Stewart and Commissioner Stewart's ability to do that. And I have that same and possibly even a deeper appreciation for Ron Anderson and his ability to bring that forward and communicate it and help me as an individual think about it, but help us as an HRA and when we sit here as a sitting city council to think about it. So I appreciate it greatly. Thank you very much.
All right, good. Director Neal, any other correspondence in front of us this morning?
No, there is not.
Okay. And HRA Commissioner Comments. Anyone have any comments they wish to make? Commissioner Brindle.
Let's see.
You want to talk about snow plowing?
Oh, thank you for plowing this morning. The plow went by just before I left, and I was able to barge through the little pile. It wasn't big enough to keep me back, but thank you.
I wanted to know if the blades were off the trucks and you had to put them back on, or if you were smart enough to leave them on.
No, they saw this coming, I'm sure.
The HRA snowplow team will be happy to hear your comments.
I just have one comment. Received a phone call from a resident in the Onyx. This is not specifically to the HRA. It's not an HRA issue. It's more a noise issue that the McDonald's at Southdale Circle is leaf blowing at 4:30 in the morning. And so I sent a note to Director Carrie Teague and to Manager Neal about that, asking for some help on that, because that is definitely managed by our noise ordinance. So I'm hoping to get some relief on that. But we have in the past been responsive to noise issues, and we will be responsive to this one. The folks living at the Onyx do love it, and so they would like not to be wakened at 4:30. So.
All right. There was an interesting article, I think, last month in the Atlantic about outlawing gas-powered leaf blowers in Washington, D.C.
Yes, that's
for a variety of health reasons and noise reasons. So maybe something our folks want to take a look at. But anyway, something for another day. Thank you, Member Brindle, or Commissioner Brindle. Anything else from folks? Yeah. Kudos on the snow plowing. Thank you to our staff, Manager Neuendorf, Manager Hawkinson, and our great team of advisors, financial and legal. Really appreciate all the great work you do. And for on the development team side, thank you for your high level of professionalism in dealing on this. And Mr. Bonjean, best of luck on this. We'll be watching carefully. It's going to be a wonderful thing to see come into our community. So, Executive Director comments.
Just to tell you that this same item, in the exact same format, will be on your agenda, council agenda on Tuesday.
All right, very good. And then Director Hawkinson, we look forward to hearing about Sandell in a couple weeks, talking about efficient use of funds. All right, anything else for the HRA this morning? All right, we stand adjourned.